So welcome to class 96 on my book, In the Beginning Was a Word, How Language Knits Reality Together. And notice I said a word, not the word. Now, we're very familiar with the passage from John, first chapter, first verse of John in the New Testament, where we have the statement, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and so on. It's a very important theological and ontological series of verses, but it's discussing something that's discussed very lengthily and very completely in the Baha'i writings as well, namely that it is the manifestation through whom God brings about creation and shapes creation according to his desire. So at the beginning of all creative processes is the advent of the manifestation. But I'm talking about something else, and we'll get to that. But before I do, a couple of people ask how to look at the slides or download the slides when you're looking at the class after it has been recorded. So I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to go to, let me see if you can see what I'm sharing here. Hold on. Okay, can you see Classes on the Baha'i Faith by John S. Hatcher? Marie, can you see that?
Yes, I can see.
Okay. So if you click on, say, the class we had last week, there'll be an advertisement probably. So we'll let that go. And we'll skip that and stop this. Now you'll see slides right here on each program. And if you click on that hyperlink, it'll take you to the slides, which you can go through manually like this, or it will also allow you to go into a slide program by clicking over here on slideshow. It'll load it, and then you'll see the slides presented as I presented them myself. So let me stop sharing that, and we will begin our discussion of the book. In the beginning was a word. So let me once again share my screen, and we'll go to the slide presentation. In the beginning was a word, how language knits reality together. I love the cover on this book. I saw this painting by Hooper Dunbar, a former House of Justice member and very multi-talented individual. His painting is just remarkable. And I love this particular painting. You see, it looks to me like lightning splitting open a craggy kind of rocky substance or something. And so you see in the beginning, and I don't know, I love this this picture. The book was published in 2017, so not that long ago, 5 years ago, 6 years ago. It's got 12 chapters, 374 pages, got lots of graphs that I use to try to explain some of the more abstract concepts of how language works. It's available at the Baha'i bookstore at this link, and it's also available on Amazon at this link. I don't believe it's available in ebook format. So we begin with chapter 1, the roots, the diaspora, and a family reunion. And what I'm talking about is the family of mankind here. So I get into very briefly sort of the history of what we think we know at this point about the origin of the Out of Africa movement by humanity, which most presume began in Africa and then moved into the across the Nile and into the Middle East and eventually spread throughout the world. And we can trace the languages of many of these tribes or peoples, because not everyone would move. Obviously, some would stay and some would stay in the next place and the next place. And that's where you get the different communities, and they form their own language and so on. So that's the roots of the family. It kind of reminds you of the Alex Haley book and a wonderful TV series called Roots. But this is our entire human family, and the diaspora, the dispersion of humanity from Africa up through the rest of the world. And we're still debating that, we, the social scientists and archaeologists and so forth, how the peoples came from the western part, the eastern part of Asia, across what was either a land bridge or a snow bridge, or what is now the Bering Straits, into this country, into the United States. And so it's an ongoing learning process about how language, the origin of language, and language itself is very fascinating, because it's one of the main indices distinguishing us from lower forms of life. You have the story of Babel, or Babel, however you pronounce it, from the Bible, which is, of course, not literally true, but it is a mythological account of how, once the people who began this diaspora get too far away from their origins, and you have language upon language upon language created, we're no longer unified, we're no longer able to communicate with one another, and the result is bewilderment and bloodshed. And the myth, of course, they're building the Tower of Babel, and the people at the top can no longer communicate with the people at the bottom, and so the construction of this great framework is now in disorder. And of course, it's a very good and very analogy, and a very applicable to today, because we are once again trying to create unity out of disunity. And in this case, it's not a matter of language exactly, though, of course, one of the main components of, or at least a major component of Baha'u'llah's concept of a framework for world unity, is a universal language and a universal script. And you see why with what's going on today. So a family reunion, this is the idea that at some point we will get back. In other words, we've sort of gone around the globe and gotten back to Africa, and symbolically, in effect, we've come full circle, and we are now in need of recovering our unity and with our language and with our ideas. And so we have a process of reflection on how to do that, of planning specifically the specific framework, something, of course, the House of Justice is busy with, and directing us with the sequence of plans, teaching plans, which are more than just teaching, aren't they? They're plans for creating a framework for world commonwealths, a world commonwealth. So you have the reflection on that, the planning of action, and then the action itself. Chapter 2 gets to the heart of what the title is about. In the beginning was the Word, of course, is, as I said, from John, the first chapter. And the premise is that all points of beginning are relative, and that is, we have, of course, the beginning of, say, the Abrahamic cycle, but before that were other universal cycles and so on, all of which are derived from the word, or the utterance, or the advent of a manifestation of God. And of course, we are created in the image of God in a figurative manner, and in a spiritual manner in the image of his emissaries, the manifestations. spiritually, we try to emulate their behavior and of course, follow their guidance that they leave us through utterance or language. And that, again, you see that the first proof of the manifestation is his utterance. So language is the central tool that the manifestation uses in carrying out his purpose for a particular stage in the development of the human body politic. So you have the concept, another axiom or premise, the perfect altruism of the creator's motive. This is something we'll get to more in a class, many classes from now, about the mind of God and the structure of reality, my last talk that I'll give in this series. And the idea is that God's sole motive, and we've talked about this many times before when we talk about the concept alluded to in the hadith of the hidden treasure, and that is God wishes to be known, therefore he brought creation into being that he might be known. Or it begins with God was alone, God wished to be known, therefore he brought creation into being that he might be known. But his motive in this is not selfish, it's totally altruistic, because he wishes to be known that he might bestow his love and his powers on beings capable of understanding them and developing them and emulating them in their interaction with one another. Fourth premise, how creation takes place. Then we get into the whole concept of evolution, evolution as a spiritual process, and evolution insofar as the complexification of the structures, the social structures that carry out God's plans into our everyday life. So why the creator refines his work indirectly? In other words, why doesn't he simply do it directly? Well, of course, that would be, in one sense, impossible, since the creator is entirely spiritual. And so he uses an intermediary, namely the manifestations, and teaches us indirectly, as do they. And this is something we discussed when we discussed the book, The Face of God Among Us, where we went into some detail about the teaching techniques of the manifestation, which is, as I said at the time, was something that I paid a great deal of attention to as I first became a professor at the university level and tried to see what the strategies were the manifestation used. My premise being that if they are teachers from God, they are perfect teachers, and therefore their technique must be also perfect. And the main quality, as we've been discussing all along, of their technique is indirection. And that indirection is carried out both in their actions and in their language. So their language is full of poetic expressions, symbols, analogies, parables, that force us to think. Because again, if they simply told us what to think and had us memorize certain rules and regulations and so forth, we would not really be gaining much. We would simply be imitating rather than thinking for ourselves. And free will is a completely essential quality we must utilize in this process if it is to be our learning and not our imitation of someone else's learning. And so you have the twin methods, which require twin responses, the twin methods being the social teachings and the spiritual teachings, though it's really in reverse of that. First, you have the spiritual teachings, the concepts, and then the social teachings that carry out those spiritual concepts into daily action and social norms. So the word that was the beginning, and here it takes to chapter 3 to explain the title, which is in the beginning was a word. Well, what is that word? And the word is be, the imperative be. which is the wish of God that creation come into being, which automatically sets in progress the whole process whereby the manifestations carry out the will of God on each planet where human life is evolving. And so you have the term in the original kun fayakunu, which means be and it is, meaning that God has but to say be and it will become whatsoever he desires. And in the long obligatory prayer, we talk about the manifestations being the means by which the B and E are joined and knit together. In other words, you have two parts to this process. And though this isn't authoritative, my own notion of this would be the two parts of this imperative come into being or be are the spiritual and the social. And so reason I included the Spanish version of that same expression is to show you that it's in the original, it's not B and E, that's the English translation of that. It's the two parts of in any language of the imperative be. So in English, it's se. All right, so you have the conjoining or knitting together of the letters ese and e. So language is the principal proof, as I said, and the principal teaching tool employed by the manifestations. This is talked about at length, of course, in the Kitab-i-Iqan. So in the beginning, you have the creator, language as the medium for revelation, and the twofold nature of the revealed verses, which would be the spiritual and the social, and the twofold nature of reality, which is the outward expression of that same process, where you have the realm of the spirit and the realm of physical reality, which, as we've discussed many times, is really one reality with two dimensions that are inseparable. Even as the first command of Baha'u'llah in the Kitab-i-Aqdas is talking about the two things are required of every individual. The first is recognition of the prophet for his day, or for the day in which he appears, and to obey the ordinances of the prophet. So these things, Baha'u'llah ends that paragraph saying, are inextricable. Neither is acceptable without the other. So you can't simply do good works and know what you're doing. You have to understand the basis for the works you do. What is the framework in which you are responding to the admonitions and exhortations and guidance of the prophet? So we go to chapter 4, the mind as intermediary. This we have discussed before at great length by comparing the mind in one sense as an intermediary between the soul and the body, or the brain, which operates the body, in the same way that the manifestation is the intermediary between God and man. So Socrates to the rescue is this same idea of the Socratic thought of you have the light, which is the source of understanding. You have the humanity imprisoned in the recesses of the cave, and then you have the manifestation who goes down into the recesses and leads people out. So the basics of communication. And so this is my own observations. These aren't from authoritative texts. But the basics of communication. Well, let me say one more thing before that. We have the question, can there be thought without language? And by that, I mean abstract thought. You know, in a sense, you can say an animal can utilize language to the extent it can respond to commands. We can teach Coco to sign for what Coco likes or wants to eat or whatever. But when we're talking about abstract thought, think about this when the class is over. Can you consider any concept or reflect on it in your mind without using words? I don't mean out loud, but words as you consider them. And that's a whole theory of language, is that it is essential for an individual to have language in order to develop as a human being. We'll get to more of that later, particularly in the Q&A. But it's an interesting concept, and some theorize that no, without the ability, or without, not the ability to have language, to acquire language, but without language, we cannot think abstractly. This is why the child, in one sense, very rapidly goes from simply being able to name things, obviously express emotion, but if you have raising a child alongside raising a puppy, you'll see they'll be sort of parallel in advancement until the point where the child can express concepts. And by concepts, we mean describe emotions, discuss feelings, so on. So in the beginning was a sentence. And why do I say that? Because all communication or all discussion consists of sentences. Anything you say, even if it's an expletive, implicit, there is a subject and a verb. And so if you want to talk about that in the Q&A, we can, but just take my word for it at the moment. All communication consists of sentences. So in the beginning, there was a sentence and there was a teacher. The recapitulation theory, what is that? This is in relation to this in the same sense I was just talking about, the child development. The recapitulation theory is that human evolution and advancement follows more or less the same path or levels of advancement, or as does the child in the womb of the mother. So you can, according to this theory, discern in the rapid 9-month evolution of the child from a zygote to a fully developed human being, well, not fully developed, but ready to learn on the outside, in the same way that you have human beings on planet Earth emerging from cellular life all the way up to the humanoid, which is ready to understand concepts and so forth, to advance. And so the prophets in this analogy would be like the parents in that comparison. So we have here a graph showing what we just described. You have the realm of the inspired soul, which is, of course, is constantly with us. You have the inspiration to do something. You have the intermediary of the mind or brain connection, and the translation of that plan into action, willful action. And I say carry it out systematically, because if you want to accomplish change in your reality, you do it until it is habituated, until it becomes sort of a mindless response. You don't need to think about it, and then you go to another level of carrying it out. So we've got a process for the creation of words that you have, again, a lot of theories about the origin of language, how it takes place. You would do well to look on something as accessible as Wikipedia or something to look up the various theories of how language comes about. But it doesn't take much imagination to understand how that would happen. You begin with the names of things, the sounds that indicate an action, and then you have a sentence. Eat, which could mean let's eat, or I want to eat, or you are eating, or whatever. Or I see an animal, let's kill it so we can eat. So in other words, it goes from very simple communication to more and more complex as it is needed. So it's on an as-need basis. The more complex the idea that is being communicated, the more complex the language has to become. In the beginning, according to Plato, and also according to the Baha'i writings, language has some I say according to the Baha'i writings, I think that's true. I may be misremembering that originally the sound itself replicated something reminiscent of the object that it names. And so we can imagine that it's fascinating if you think about it, the incredible variety of languages, from the Oriental languages to the Middle Eastern languages to the native tribal languages throughout the world, through and the grammars of these languages and so on. It's fascinating to study, but it's also fascinating that they're so diverse, as are the scripts, the various scripts of the world. And so you can see why it is so important, if we are to be a unified world community, that we must be able to communicate rapidly and quickly. Always a need of an educator. We never outgrow the need for further enlightenment. Learning to speak soul to soul, and then where the memory resides. This is something that is very important for Baha'i Baha'is who are dealing with neurological sciences. I think they should be at the forefront in discussing the non-locality of the human mind. And we've talked about this at great length before. That is that obviously, according to Baha'i belief, the source of our essential reality, our memory, our will, our abstract thought, and so forth, is the soul, not the brain. So the brain enables the communication between the soul and the body, but the memory doesn't reside in the brain, nor does the language. It resides in the soul, and the brain, if injured, is no longer capable. If you have, say, an injury and you have aphasia, or some disease and you have aphasia, where you can no longer draw on words, it would seem to all the world that, well, it's because those were stored in that part of your brain. But as we've said before, the brain can rewire itself in some cases, and the person can learn to talk again and recall. In other words, specific things can be injured and specific capacities can be restored. So the point of dissociation then is in the dissociation that occurs if the brain as intermediary is injured or deteriorates because of some form of disease. So the spirit encompasses the soul. This is from the writings, Baha'u'llah, Some Answered Questions, chapter 40, paragraph 5, and that shouldn't be 1,789, but 179 through 80 pages. And this is fascinating insofar as this relationship between the spirit and the body is concerned. For example, the mind and the spirit of man are aware of all his states and conditions, of all the parts and members of his body, and of all his physical sensations, as well as of his spiritual powers, perceptions, and conditions. This is an essential knowledge through which man realizes his own condition. And this doesn't, as he goes on to say, this doesn't require effort. This is immediate and existential realization of how you're doing. And this is the reason for this, he says. He both senses and comprehends it, for the spirit encompasses the body and is aware of its sensations and powers. This knowledge is not the result of effort and acquisition. It is an existential matter. It is pure bounty. So in other words, we don't have to struggle to be aware of how we're doing what condition we're in, and so on. Because, and of course, he says the spirit in the previous translation, it says the spirit surrounds the body. Well, surrounds encompasses same idea, but obviously, since the spirit is non-physical, it doesn't mean literally, or does it? Well, we don't know. We just know that it is having an associational or associative relationship with the body, and therefore the spirit is aware of it. And the spirit, of course, doesn't depend on the body. So as Baha'u'llah says, if you have some illness of body or mind, the soul is not affected thereby. But the communication between the body and the soul is. So I drew some graphs that might be helpful. The soul, which emanates from God, some powers of the soul are associated with the brain are self-consciousness, will, rational thought, memory, reflection, love, meditation, and then the spirit I have surrounding the body or associating with the body. But all of this then is accomplished through this intermediary of the brain. And so what happens with language? You would think that it would be a simple thing. You say a word to someone and they comprehend it or they don't. Well, really, when you think of it, it's a very complicated process. We begin outside the physical realm in the metaphysical realm, and from the soul emanates the will to do something, which is then processed to the mind, which again, remember, the mind is a power of the soul, which communicates it to the brain because it's surrounding the body, the spirit is. And then the brain utilizes the speech center, and that utilizes the vocalization powers, which then create in the larynx the sound waves or vibrations of the air, which are then received by the auditory nerves of the person you're speaking to, which then is translated from those impulses into comprehension of the word as part of the brain function. And the brain then communicates that to the mind and to the will and to the soul. So of course, it's a lot more complicated than that, and we know exactly how some of these things work in human physiology. Here's another one that gives you a specific thing. So this person wants to say the word key to this person. Now, of course, this is in the English language. It would be another word, clave in Spanish, whatever. So the soul says, or from the soul, the will decides, I want to say key to this person because the person needs to give me the key. And so the mind comes up with the word in its repository. And again, the repository of the words is not in the brain. It is communicated from the mind to the brain, which translate the concept into a sound. And through the configuration of the mouth and tongue and breath, the lips say key. And then from key, you have the sound waves going from that word. Again, same thing, vibrations into electronic signals. And he says key means, and he envisions what it means in his mind or her mind, and so on. So that's an example of a specific thing being communicated. So the word and the divine methodology, the value of physical experience, we've discussed many times. Revelation and the word made flesh, of course, referring to the fact that the word of God is given a fleshly form that we might understand God in a human form, how God would act and so on, but mainly the words of God, which are the words that bring creation into being and which guide us. And so you have this indirection and the advent of spring. I'm not even sure what I'm talking about there. I don't remember. It's the word made flesh. Rending the veils of word. That's, of course, talking about metaphor and symbol, which we discussed at length before. But words all have veils, so that a word can mean different things in different contexts. And you trying to take the veils away from the words, particularly when they are veiled, intentionally veiled, such as the Hazarat al-Quds or the Mashriq al-Azkar. All of these terms designating particular things have a spiritual meaning, and so we can unveil them. Mashriq al-Azkar means the dawning place of the word of God, or the praise of God, I forget. Unto every nation we sent a prophet. That's a quote from the Quran. And the authority of early religious texts, the Hindu and so on. So I go into specific examples of various religions and what their authoritative texts were. So, of course, down here, very important, I go into what is the Baha'i concept of the authoritative text, as opposed to simply things written about the faith, such as my own books, which are not authoritative. So it's important that, and of course, we've gone over that before. I don't need to go over it again, but it's very important when you're talking about the Baha'i faith or explaining the Baha'i faith that you are able to explain what an authoritative text is versus someone's ideas about the faith, even though they may be highly esteemed individuals for whatever reason. Their word has no authority until it is given that authority. Indirect language, and this is something I discuss, excuse me, in at great length in the book, The Ocean of His Words, figurative language and the manifestations, why they employ it so much. Of course, Christ talks about that, why he uses parables. And he says that I use them because they think they understand, but they don't. And so I'm forcing them to figure out my answers to their questions. And he goes on to his disciples and explains by using an example of the sower, I think is the parable he uses after that, how the words are like seeds that are cast on the ground, and some of the ground is receptive and fertile, and some of the ground is full of weeds and so on. And so these represent different people who hear the word. Some are receptive, some are not. So it gives some background about the various kinds of figurative language, hermeneutical principles, a doorway to the inner mysteries of language, particularly myths and illusions, symbols and metaphors, parable, fable, or allegorical tale, all of which we find in Scripture. Imagery, which is very important. That's more of the beautification of the language, though sometimes it's crucial to understanding as well. Personifications and epithets. Personification, for example, Satan is a personification. That's important. We understand that it is a personification, not a reality. And the same with epithets, which are those lofty titles we may bestow upon God or the prophet or other exalted individuals. And the persona device, that's something that you might really enjoy getting into. It's a device that we've talked about in the past when we were dealing with the tablet of the Holy Mariner, where the speaker is talking about Baha'u'llah, and even though Baha'u'llah is the author of the tablet of the Holy Mariner, and he's a character in it. So the persona device is where the narrative becomes a character in the thing. The same thing is true with the Suri Heiko. The character or persona of the speaker most of the time is the Maiden of Heaven that appears before Baha'u'llah in the Sea Child. So I include in the book, and we don't need to go through these because we've gone through them before, but the difference between a symbol and a metaphor. So this is a symbol. You have a cross. It alludes to Christianity, and you can uncover the illusion, meaning you can figure out why it represents Christianity by studying Christian history. And of course, you know that Christ was crucified upon the cross. So it symbolizes the sacrificial act of Christ in carrying his word to humankind. And then, as opposed to a metaphor, where you have Christ comparing himself to the bread, and here you don't have a symbol. You can a metaphor can become a symbol, but here you're looking for the common variable in this. What do these two things in this Venn chart, what do they share in common? They're both sources of nourishment. This is spiritual nourishment. This is physical nourishment, and that's the meaning. Whereas the meaning in the symbol is derived directly from it, though sometimes if you don't understand the symbol, you have to study it and figure out, I don't understand what it's referring to. Why does Baha'u'llah refer himself as the holy mariner? Well, that's symbolic, isn't it? But it's also metaphorical. He's like a mariner in that he is guiding the boat, the Ark of the Covenant, across the perilous seas. So how does language weave reality together? Well, I'm going to kind of finish up here by getting to the central metaphor of the book, which is the weaving process. And if you know anything about weaving, you have the thing you're trying to create, a tapestry in this case, in the book. So you're creating a tapestry, and so you have the fabric of the social order is being compared to putting the social order together, to putting a tapestry together. And so you have the experience of conjoining reality with the spiritual reality with physical reality through language. All right. And so you're using it as a source of weaving. And so I use a chart here to show that here's the metaphysical realm, here's the physical realm. And so the language of the manifestation, which emanates from the metaphysical realm, expresses spiritual concepts in action or physical reality, and thereby weaves it together. So you can imagine these are different virtues or actions that individuals are admonished to carry out, and thereby you weave these, which are really all together to begin with. They're really unified, but you're expressing this unity in social form, social structure. So you have a spiritual society. Well, and so this weaving here, this is the needle carrying the thread through these. And then we've used this one before, so it gets ever more advanced as you express this reciprocity between knowledge and action. But let me continue with the weaving part. This is a weaving together of the manifestations. How are they woven together? Well, you have the nighttime, which is a very important metaphor or symbol in the scriptures. It's the time of spiritual darkness. So you have the nightingale, which is a bird that sings in the night and awakens everyone. And then you have the dawning of the new religion, the ascent of the religion, and it reaches its effulgence. But over time, when the need for a new revelation occurs, the old religion begins to decline in its efficacy, its ability to guide humankind, or it becomes perverted. At least that's happened in the past, though that nighttime like here will not occur again, we are told in the writings. So you have a transition between the dispensations that weaves them together. So you have four parts of that transition: the prophecies from the previous manifestation, the sign of the new manifestation in some celestial event, a literal celestial event, and then the signs in the heaven of figurative celestial events, and that is luminaries such as John the Baptist foretelling the coming of the Messiah, Sheikh Ahmadi Oksai foretelling the coming of the Qayyum, the Qayyim and the Qayyum, which is the Bab and Baha'u'llah, and then the manifestation appears and brings his own proof of his reality, the five proofs of which we mentioned in going over the Igan. And so here is how that goes. You have a religion that's in its nighttime, and then you have these four parts of the transition, and you have the ascent of a new religion. And so if you look at that over time, you can see you have a descent of Judaism, its ineffectualness, it becomes legalistic. Christianity, the same thing occurs. It becomes dysfunctional administratively in particular, and then splits into thousands of divisions, the main one of which at first is between Eastern and Western Catholicism, and then between Catholicism, Western Catholicism, and Protestantism, and so on. And then you have the advent of Muhammad and Islam, and then the decline of Islam almost at its beginning, though it still has as we've noted, a great influence on the advancement of civilization. The same four parts of transition, the Baha'i faith, you may think, well, it didn't descend. Well, of course it did, and Baha'u'llah, as we've noted throughout the course, uses the appellation, "O people of the Bayan," to allude to those many Babis who not only did not recognize Baha'u'llah, but who warred against him. So the ultimate use of this metaphor of creating the tapestry of a world commonwealth is the loom as the framework of reality, the dispensations as the warp of the eternal covenant, and the reiteration of spiritual virtues, and you get this right here. So here's the loom of the eternal covenant. Here's the warp and the woof. The warp are these lines here, are the themes of each. You can say these are the repeated spiritual verities that go through all of the religions, because the spiritual verities don't change, even though they become ever more complex in their understanding and expression. And then you have the weaving throughout this of the lesser covenants, or the minor plan of God. So the eternal covenant, if you will, is the whole framework for this tapestry. It's not a perfect analogy, but it's useful. So you have the unity of the major themes in the fabric of the eternal covenant, which are the oneness of God, the unity of the manifestations, the unity of spiritual and social action, the oneness of humankind, the destiny of humankind to establish a global polity or a world commonwealth. And there we go. So again, there's a lot more ideas in the book than, obviously, as I've said before, and I'll say the same thing in the next two books coming up. It took quite a time to write these books, and all that I intend that you get from these presentations is a sense of the kind of thing I'm trying to present, that hopefully it may be of some value. I enjoyed doing them, or I wouldn't have done them, and I hope you get something out of them too.